Hello, and welcome to Tangled Twists. I'm Melissa, and today we're going to be using our own measurements to draft a pattern for a panel skirt. I had drafted my panel skirt pattern a number of years ago, so there was a little bit of extra work to reverse engineer this back to what I had done initially. Panel skirts are often a way of making a circle skirt that takes away a lot of the extra handling that you have to do by cutting fabric on the bias. Typically, a lot of circle skirt patterns will have you make a quarter of your circle on one piece of fabric, which means a large portion of the hem is on the bias. Anytime you have fabric on the bias, it's going to stretch. It's just what it likes to do. So if you're making more of a traditional circle skirt, you generally want to hang it for a while to let the fabric relax and to let the hem go to where it's going to be before you level it. So cut it even and then go and hem your skirt. With a panel skirt, you're cutting that circle into even slices. So if you want to make a 6-panel circle skirt, you have 6 panels, you're cutting your circle into 6 slices. That makes it a little bit easier to handle, and very often you're able to fit those pieces on the straight grain. When you put it on the straight grain, you make it so that it's a lot harder for your hem to flex, and I have never found the need to hang my panel skirts to be able to level the hem. Normally I can just go straight into hemming them. Now, because this is a way of making a circle skirt, I had thought that the panel that I was using was a full circle. It is not. It is actually a 3/4 circle skirt. So if you're just making it plain, it's not going to flare all the way out and flat and platter-like. It's going to flare, but it's going to look a little bit more like a flower. I think I did it that way initially to prevent wardrobe malfunction opportunities. I don't remember, but it works, and that's what we're going to be going with today. To draft this skirt, we're going to need a couple things. First, you are going to need your waist measurement, and you are going to need the length that you want your skirt to be. Those are all the measurements that you need for now. You also need some kind of hard ruler. I like to use a yardstick or one of the quilting rulers. I like yardsticks because sometimes when you're making skirts, they can get to be quite long, and you want to have the straightest possible line that you can have for this. You're also going to need a bit of string, a pin, and something heavy. I like to use a cork board and then a box of kitty litter if you have weight sacks of flour, sacks of sugar to weight things down. But we're going to need to draft the curve of a circle at some point. And to do that, it really helps if you have something heavy on one end that you can tie your string to make that shape. You're also going to need paper on which to do this. I usually use medical exam paper for my patterns, but I don't often use that for drafting. I did this time because I was in a hurry and it worked just fine. So if you have medical exam paper, it absolutely will work. Normally what I would use is some of the brown paper rolls that you can get at craft stores and dollar stores. It's about the same width as medical exam paper, so sometimes you do have to tape it together to get a big enough piece, but it's a lot sturdier. It's more like using a brown paper bag. That can be a lot easier to handle if you're not used to something that's as soft and tissue papery as medical exam paper. Once we have the skirt panel drafted, I will show you how to guesstimate about how much yardage you will need for your fabric for this. It's going to vary based on the length of your skirt and your measurements. I know for me, I can usually get away with about 3 yards for most types of skirts, unless they're very long or very full. If you have an amount that you usually find works well for you for skirts, you will probably need about that much. Otherwise, we'll go over how to figure that out once we have the pattern. So let's go ahead and get started. To make a circle skirt pattern, we're going to have to do a little bit of circle math. Don't worry, it looks harder than it is. A circle skirt is basically 2 nested circles. So you have circle 1 that I'm going to call C1, and that is your waist measurement. For me, that is 30 inches. That's the first number that you need. The second circle goes around the first circle. We're going to call this circle 2, and that measurement is your hem, but we don't know what that number is yet. That's where we need to do some math. Fortunately, we can do that with the circumference equation. Because we have this number, we can figure out what R is. R is the radius, so we need first to know what our first radius is. So we're going to take our circumference and we're going to divide it by 2 times pi. Pi is 3.14. You want to keep that 0.14 on there. Your numbers will come out very different if you don't include them. So we need 30 divided by 2 times 3.14. You do the math on the bottom first, and that comes out to 4.77 inches. Now, to get this circumference, we need to know how long that radius is. We're going to call this R2. Now, we already know part of R2 because its math is that first number we just got, the 4.77, plus how long we want our skirt to be. I'm taking 24 inches here. When you add these together, you get 28.77. And now we have our R. That means we can do the math. We can multiply this times 2 times pi, and that number is 180.6. Again, this is all in inches. I'm American. I do math in inches. I should do it in centimeters. It makes a lot more sense, but I don't. So we have our 180.6 inches. Now, the thing with making a panel skirt is that I'm not trying to make one big circle piece here. I'm trying to make a segment of the circle. So I need to know how many segments I want my circle to have. My pride skirt was 8 panels. So I'm going to take my first circumference measurement and I'm going to divide it by 8. So we're going to take 30 divided by 8 is 3.75 inches. Our hem divided by 8 is 22.57 inches. Now, we know how long this piece is and how long this piece is. If I were making this a full circle skirt, we could stop right here. It took me a minute to figure out what I had done with the pride skirt because I was using a pattern I had had for a while. Turns out it's not actually a full circle. It's actually 3/4 of a circle. So this little bit here is gone. I don't know why I did it that way, but that's what I did, so that's what I'm going to show you. That means I need to take 1/4 of these away. 1/4 is equal to 2/8. So I'm going to multiply this 22.57 by 2, and that is 45.14. Now I'm going to come back and take that hem measurement, and I am going to subtract that 45.14 from it. That gives me 135.45. That is my final hem circumference. So I'm going to divide that by 8, and it ends up giving me 16.9 inches. I know, it sounds really confusing. The important thing is we're not changing this measurement. We didn't change the waist at all. The waist still needs to go around the same number of times. We've just made how big the hem is a little bit smaller, but the waist will end up staying the same. So to clean this up, we need, we'll call this measurement A, measurement B, and our length will be measurement C. So A equals 3.75 inches. That's our little bit here. B equals 16.9 inches. That's here. And our C, our length, equals 24 inches. And with those 3 numbers, we're ready to draft the pattern. Draw a line down the center of your paper the length of measurement C. If you can, use something with a grid underneath your paper. It really helps to keep your lines square. Then you need your waist, A, and hem, B measurements. You're going to put half the measurement on each side of the line you just drew. For example, if your hem measurement was 20 inches, put 10 inches on either side of your line. Next, you're going to connect the ends of your lines. You can cheat and only do this on one side and then fold and trace it later if you want. Now we need your R2 measurement to sweep the hemline. A curved hem will make the skirt more level. This can be a little tricky to do, especially if you have a long measurement. Use a cotton string. Cotton is best for this because cotton doesn't really stretch, and tie it to your pen. Tie a knot in the other end that makes your string the length of R2, and pin it to something like a small cork board or heavy cork coaster. Weight the cork board down with something really heavy. We're talking 10 plus pounds if you can manage it. I'm using a 28-pound box of kitty litter. This setup lets you put a good amount of tension on your string without anything pulling up or coming loose. I've had a lot of difficulty using tape in the past because the tape comes loose as the string moves. Once you have your setup made, line up the string with your center line and make sure your pen touches the center line at the hem. Put light tension on the string, hold your pen straight up, and gently sweep it from side to side. Your first line is going to be wobbly if you haven't done this a few times, so it can be helpful to have some colored pencils or markers on hand. You can change the colors out until you get a line you like and use the color to tell you which line to use. For the pride skirt, I made the scalloped edges that went past the initial hem. Since this was a smaller section, I used my finger to anchor the string at the hem center. I measured out to a hem corner and swept around to make half a circle. Before you can cut your pattern out, you need to add a seam allowance. 5/8 inch is standard on most big patterns, but I prefer using 1/2 inch, so that's what I'm marking. When you get to the curves, you can still use your straight ruler. Line up a small segment of the line with the ruler and draw a short line at that point. Move your ruler around the curve and keep repeating, then connect your lines. It works best if you try to make a lot of small lines rather than a few long ones. Now label your pattern with how many panels it is, what your waist measurement is, what your skirt length is, and what you used as seam allowance. I know it seems like a lot, but all of that information is really helpful to have later on. You can now cut out your pattern. I like my clothes to have pockets whenever possible, so we're also drafting a pocket pattern. You can cheat here and use a pocket pattern from another pattern if you want to. Make sure it goes to the waistline and use the pattern markings that already exist. I've lined my stitching line up on the grid, and I've made a mark 2 inches down from the waist. Then I use my hand to measure how big I want the pocket opening and make another mark. I used about 7 inches. Place some paper over the seam and transfer the seam line and the marks you just made. Make sure you leave a seam allowance space below your bottom mark. I like my phone to sit at least 2/3 of the way into my pockets, so that's where I position my template. The mark at the bottom of the template will be my bottom seam line. I like big pockets, so I'm marking 2 inches past my phone to make a larger pocket bag. Don't go too much bigger than your panel piece's waist measurement. You could end up with bulky pockets that change how the skirt hangs. Then I complete the lines to make a pocket bag. You need a tab where the pocket opening is going to be. This is what lets you put it into a seam while allowing the pocket bag to hang loose. The top of the pocket bag is really big. Since you can't store things up there and it's going to overhang the panel, we need to narrow it down. I'm drawing a diagonal line that starts at the center of the pocket opening and reduces the top by about half. I always leave some pocket to connect in the waist seam. Doing so helps stabilize the pocket and moves any weight to the waist. If you don't connect the pocket bag, the weight of your pocket contents will pull it down and take the skirt with it. Once you have your pocket shape, you can add your seam allowance, label, and cut. Alright, let's do some yardage estimation. I love my grids for this because it makes it really easy. You need the widest part of your pattern and the longest part of your pattern, rounded up. Always round up for this. It's better to have more fabric than less. So we're calling this 18 inches wide by 26 inches tall. The width is, in theory, what I want to go across my piece of fabric, selvage to selvage. That means I need sections that are 18 inches wide. It is The linen that I like to use is 58 inches wide. So if I divide 58 by 18, that means I can get 3 pieces across that width of fabric. That is an overestimate because I absolutely can get 4 panels if I top and tail them. But if you're working with something with a pattern, you can't do that. So again, always better to overestimate. I know that this is an 8-panel skirt. If I can get 3 in each layer, that means I'm going to need 3 layers. So 3 times 26 means that I need 78 inches. Divide that by 36. That means I need about 2 yards. There's going to be enough overage likely in the corners and between things for you to squeeze your waistband and pocket pieces in. But again, it is always better to round up. If you can get 2.5 yards or 3 yards, that's even better. So that's generally how you would want to math this out. You can try it using your panel in different ways. You can make a graph paper representation to scale and see exactly how you can fit everything. But that is the basic overestimating way that you figure out how much fabric you need. I'm sure you've noticed that we haven't made a pattern for the waistband. Since waistbands are long rectangles, I don't usually pattern them, but I will cover what you need to do when we cut the waistband out. It's time to cut out the fabric. The center line that you drew on your pattern is also the grain line. You can cut your pieces on grain or on cross grain, whichever gives you the best fabric usage. I'm doing mine on grain so I can stack the pieces next to each other. My fabric is doubled so that I get 2 pieces every time I cut. When I'm cutting lots of pieces on linen, I like to trace them out before I cut. Linen is wiggly and your scissors can shift the fabric. Tracing also gives you a chance to make sure your pieces are going to fit the way you think they will. Be sure to transfer your pattern markings. I'm using regular chalkboard chalk. It makes a thicker line than tailor's chalk and comes out a little bit easier. When I cut, I'll be cutting on the insides of the lines. Once my pattern pieces are traced, I draw on my waistband. I'm doing this one as a lined waistband instead of a fold-over waistband. The waistband is a rectangle that is 3 inches wide, and your waist measurement plus seam allowance and overlap if desired. I like to have my waistband overlap a little because I can't always get the edges to match up nicely, and it makes it a little bit easier to close the waistband later. Don't use more than 2 inches for overlap. My waistband is 32 inches long, 30 inches for the waist, 1/2 inch times 2 for seam allowance plus 1 inch for overlap. If you want a pattern piece for your waistband, use those measurements on your paper to cut your pattern. Be sure to label it with the length, seam allowance, and that it's for the panel skirt. When I cut my pieces, I stay to the inside of the chalk lines except between the panels. There I cut up the center of each line. We're going to prep our first sewing batch. The first batch is usually the biggest, and they'll get smaller from there. Divide your number of panels in half to know where your pockets need to go. My skirt has 8 panels, so 4 panels will be in the front and 4 panels will be to the back. The pockets go in the seam between the fronts and the backs. I also need a zipper in the center back. Don't pin more than 2 pieces together at a time at this stage. It's easier to work with smaller pieces, so we want to keep everything small for as many steps as we can. I'm pinning 2 sets of panels together. That uses 4 panels, and then I pin 3 sides of the waistband together. For the remaining 4 panels, I'm attaching the pockets at their marks. Be careful here. If you pin all the pockets to the same side of the skirt panel piece, they won't work. I'm alternating as I go to make sure that I have my pockets on correctly. You should have 2 sets of mirrored pairs. Now we sew. You're going to sew all of batch 1. For the pocket pieces, only sew the length of the pocket seam. Sew from the waist edge down. For the waistband, start on a short side, then turn the corner to the long side and sew to the other short side. Then turn the work again, but stop before you get to the remaining long side. To turn, keep the needle in the work and raise your presser foot. Rotate the fabric and then lower the presser foot. By keeping the needle down, you make sure your fabric stays in position. On the panels, sew the seam from the waist to the hem. Best practice is always to sew in the same direction. It can be hem to waist on all pieces if you want, but I prefer to go from the waist to the hem because sometimes fabric shifts and it's more important that the waist be accurate. You can change or level the hem without it affecting the fit of the garment. It's time to press batch 1. I start all pressing by pressing the seam as sewn. For the pockets, I press the seam open and then press the seam allowance to the pocket side. I missed a step here. The next step should be to fold the pocket onto the panel, covering the raw edges of the seam and pressing again. The waistband gets some special treatment. Trim off the top 2 corners by making a diagonal cut that gets close to the stitching. Be careful not to cut the stitching. Press as sewn and then turn the piece so the seams are on the inside. Use the nose of the iron to get into the corners. Fold the piece flat and press. The skirt sections, I'm pressing the seams open, but I'm only preparing one for felling. These are my center back and my center front seams. I'll be felling the center front seam, but I'll need to pick out some or all of the center back seam to put my zipper in. On my center front piece, I trim down one allowance and then I press the other side over it. Finally, I tuck under the top allowance and press. Everything is now set up for sewing batch 2. For batch 2, we're going to understitch 2 pockets and machine sew the felled seam. You need 2 pocket pieces, and they should each face in a different direction. They should be mirrored pieces. I was asked recently why I don't understitch instead of top stitch on my pockets, and honestly, it's because I've had problems with understitching in the past. Then I realized that's a pretty sad excuse, so we're going to switch it up and understitch the pockets today. It's a very similar process to top stitching, but instead of sewing the pocket bag to the skirt panel, we're going to sew the seam allowance to the pocket bag. Your stitch line should be right next to your seam. Only do this on one set of pocket panels. You only need it for your front pieces. Then we're going to finish the felled seam on our center front panel. Start at the waist and line the fold of the seam up with the center mark on your presser foot. Move the needle 1 or 2 clicks towards the seam and sew. I find this method helps keep your stitching on the fold line. They always seem to wobble a little bit for me, and if you try to go exactly down the fold, you're probably going to miss sections. Moving the needle just a little makes sure that you catch the whole seam, even if there are some wobbles. Sewing batch 3 is assembling the pocket panels. Lay out one set of pocket pieces facing right side up. You should have a pocket sticking out to each side. It doesn't matter if they're an understitch set or the non-understitch set, as long as they match. You don't want one understitched with one non-understitched. Now place a pocket piece wrong side up to cover each of those pieces. Your panel sandwich should have the right sides together. Make sure that your pocket seams line up. Pin your pieces around the edges to be sewn. This is around the pocket and along the seam where the pocket connects. I use a few extra pins in the middle of my pieces to prevent them from shifting. You also need to pin from the waist edge to the top mark on your pocket. I use a pin that goes with the seam between pocket marks to remind myself not to sew there. That's the pocket opening. The bottom of your pocket bag should hang free. It should not be caught in the skirt seam. I like to start with the short seam that goes from the waist to the top pocket mark so that I don't forget to do it. Sew over the existing seam, not your understitching, until you reach your mark. Break thread, then start at the top corner of the pocket. You'll sew down and around the pocket edge, turning the work and turning corners as you go. When you reach your second pocket mark, remove any pins that might be in the way. Keep your needle down and lift the presser foot. Turn the work 90 degrees and sew across to the seam allowance that's already stitched. Keep your needle down, raise the presser foot, and turn the work again. You're now ready to sew the skirt seam. Sew down to the hem. Repeat this for the other pocket panel. Finishing the seam below the pocket is a little bit different. We're going to fell it, but there's a pocket in the way, so we need to change up the process a bit. Just below the pocket, you need to clip the seam allowance. Sewing has made part of a little square where the pocket and skirt connect. Go in at an angle and snip into the corners, being careful not to cut the stitching. This frees up the seams so you can press and fell normally. Check to see which panel you're on. You should see the understitching on the top or front piece. Use that to help you fell to your preferred direction. I'm felling to the back. Complete the fell on each seam below the pocket. Line up the edges of the fell with the central line on the presser foot. Move your needle 1 or 2 clicks towards the seam and stitch. Watch the folded fabric to make sure it doesn't pop out. If it does, Stop sewing with your needle down and adjust the seam before continuing to sew. Lay out your center front panel with right sides up. Place one of your pocket panels right side down. Fold the panel back to check that the pocket opening points to the front and pin the seam. Repeat the process for the other side. The project is now to the stage where there will be a lot of floppy fabric that can get in the way, so we need to pin it out of the way so that it can't. Fold the fabric away from the seam lines and pin it into place to secure it. You now should have a neat packet that you can take to the machine. As you sew each seam, the rest of the skirt fabric stays connected and out of the way of the needle. Press and fell as usual. I like my seams to be felled toward the back of the garment. This is a personal preference. If you like, you can have the seams all point to the left or to the right, or you can fell toward the front. Do whatever you think looks the nicest. We have reached zipper installation. I've got my center back panel on the ironing board and I make sure the seam is pressed open. Then the zipper needs to be pressed. The teeth need to be rolled back so you can stitch right up near them. I hate doing this. The zipper is synthetic, so you're supposed to use a lower heat setting, but I've never managed to get the zip to cooperate with anything besides full heat, and that can melt it. See how the zip has some curve to it? That's because I was bad and used high heat. Line your zipper up with the waist edge on your center back panel. Use a pin across the seam to mark where the bottom of the zipper lands. Now open up the seam to that pin. The pressed edge shows you where you're going to line up your zip. Open the zipper. On one side, line up the zipper teeth over the pressed line and pin the zip in place. The right side of the fabric should be facing up, the zipper teeth should be visible, and the zipper tape should be on the side with the seam allowance. Change to your zipper foot. You absolutely need a zipper foot for this or you won't be able to get close enough to the zipper teeth. Start at the waist edge. Press the edge of the foot up against the zipper teeth. Move your needle all the way to the side with the zipper teeth and sew the length of the zipper. Remove the pins as you go and stop just above the zipper pull. Even though I'm using an invisible zip, I'm using a standard zipper foot. It works just as well as an invisible zipper foot, but you do need to make sure it's pushing the teeth open as you sew. I thought I would be all fancy and pin the second side of the zip while I was at the machine. Total fail. I've twisted the zip and need to pick out one side and redo it. To avoid this mistake, give yourself a good amount of space where you can be sure the zipper is in the correct orientation before you pin it. It helps if you have the zipper closed to get the first pin in place. Then open the zip for sewing. The second side goes just like the first, but you'll be working from the other side. Remember to change the position of your needle. Check to be sure that your zipper opens without snagging. With the zipper closed, press the fabric that sits over the zip. Very little of the zipper should be visible, and that's why we used an invisible zip. Generally, you don't top stitch on a zip that you're trying to hide because it makes it more obvious, so the zipper is complete at this point. We do still need to close the rest of the seam. I had hoped that the installation would let me use the initial seam that I had, but unfortunately it bubbled a bit, so I've removed those stitches and repinned it. Before I sew, I'm pressing out the previous crease. I can do this with my pins in because I use glass-headed pins. Glass won't melt under the iron, but plastic will. Don't do this with plastic-headed pins. To sew the seam, we need to move the bottom of the zipper out of the way. Position your piece for sewing and pull the zip end so it sticks out from the seam. Then carefully sew the seam. We need to finish the seam, so we're going to fell it like we have the others. Press the seam open and then lift the end of the zipper. You're going to clip both seam allowances toward the seam, but be careful not to cut the seam. Trim down one seam allowance and then press the untrimmed allowance over it. Tuck the allowance under and press again. As with all the other seams, we're machine felling this one as well. Since this is the back seam, it can go to either side. You need to be a little careful at the top of the seam so you don't catch the zipper tail, but then it's business as usual. The finished back panel gets sewn to the other panels and finished the same way as we've been doing. Before I put the waistband on, I'm going to go ahead and put some finish on the raw edges around the pocket. I had planned to finish the pockets before assembly and promptly forgot. Spicy brains are fun like that. This is generally how I end up learning new things and trying different techniques, so I don't really mind. I'm taking a zigzag stitch around the pocket bag to finish both seams at the same time. It won't be as clean as doing them individually, but it is a lot faster. It's also easier to do before the waistband is on. As I was working the pockets, I started wondering if I could finish the pocket seams too. Again, it's not as easy as if I had done this to start with, but it does work. You need to pay close attention so you don't catch anything you don't want in the seam, because there is a lot of fabric to get in the way at this point. You may also not be able to finish the entire seam because of some of the existing seams. Still, some finishing is better than no finishing. Putting the waistband on is fairly simple. Starting at one end of the short sides, open the waistband and pin the band to the skirt over the zipper. Then work around the waist, pinning as you go. I like to have my skirt on top when it's running through the machine so I can guide the pockets through more easily, and I pin accordingly. If you've left overlap, which I thought I had but apparently didn't, the other end of your waistband will extend past the other zipper end. You need to be really careful when sewing on the waistband. Since it's under the skirt, it's very hard to see what both pieces of fabric are doing, and you only want to catch one of the waistband pieces. To start, you'll rotate the edge of the waistband away so you can get right up to the edge of the zipper panel. I stop and check frequently that the unpinned portion of the waistband hasn't gotten near my sewing area. Since I'm already at the machine, once I have my waistband on, I set up for my hem. Measuring the seam allowance around the entire hem is much easier if you do it on your machine. I'm running a line of stitching at 1/2 inch all the way around my hem. Then we're back at the ironing board for another pressing batch. First, we're pressing out the waistband. I'm using my smaller board inside the waist opening and pressing the allowance and the waistband away from the skirt. You can also use the nose of your regular ironing board for this. It helps to support the waist opening and prevents you from accidentally pressing in creases underneath. Then I fold the free portion of the waistband into place and turn under the remaining allowance, using the stitch line as a guide. This gets pressed so I can hand sew it later. The stitching I did for the hem gives me a fold line. I fold the hem up and press using the stitching as a guide. When you're doing this, it's best if you work at a right angle to the hem. If you continuously smooth the hem at a sharper angle, it can change the way the fabric is aligned, which can result in extra flaps and folds later on. Once the first fold is pressed, I use it to make the second fold. The second fold needs a bit more attention because the edge of the skirt is bigger around than where you're folding it to. You'll likely need to push and tug on the fabric to get it to sit flat. I'm keeping with the theme of machine sewing here, so I'm going to machine sew the hem instead of whip stitching it. You want to do this with the hem fold facing down. Yes, it's scary and I hate doing it this way, but there's a reason. Having the hem underneath like this keeps the fabric flat. If you sew with the hem up, a fabric bubble will slowly develop until you have to make a tiny pleat to flatten everything out again. That doesn't happen if you sew with the hem facing down. I'm not entirely sure why it works, but I suspect it's something to do with how the feed dogs are moving the fabric. And it absolutely does work. All that's left now is to finish off the waistband and closures. I'm hand sewing this one because I hate how waistbands look when I stitch in the ditch. I know it will look better if I do it by hand, and it's a much smaller amount of sewing than most of the other seams we've done. It helps keep your waistband even if you use the machine-sewed waistband stitching as a guide. Finally, we're going to put on some hooks. Do a little try-on to see how your skirt is fitting and choose where you want your hooks to go. My waist is a little loose, so I've chosen to overlap the waistband slightly. It's wide enough that it's going to need 2 hooks. I position the bars first, keeping them at the top and bottom edges of the waistband. You can sew through the waistband here as it will be on the inside. I sew each end of the bar separately. Once the bars are sewn, I use them to help align the hooks. I prefer the stitching not to show on the outside, so I'm only sewing the hooks to the inner layer of the waistband. Unlike the bars, I sew the hooks with a continuous piece of thread. Make sure you catch the stitching point in the middle of the hook. Sewing it there helps keep your hook from pulling forward from the fabric where it can be seen. I love my 18th century skirts and wear them all the time, and I feel like I've done a disservice to my panel skirts because I have forgotten exactly how cute these things can be. My panel skirts are a little bit older and they have some very small flaws that only I can see, so I tend not to wear them because the very small flaws bother me. But looking at this purple skirt, I feel like I need to give these a little bit more play because they are just so cute. You have the really nice, more tailored look as you go from the waist over the hips. The flare of the skirt is excellent. You get a really lovely drape with it. You can put pockets in it. Can't argue with that. You gotta love a skirt with pockets. Plus, if you want to do something a little bit more interesting, because the skirt is made in panels, it's very easy to cut those panels apart and use them to make something totally different. You can put color blocks in them. You can use it to expand or contract the skirt in interesting ways. Check out my Pride skirt video for a little bit more instruction on that, because I did a lot with one of these to really push what you can do with just a simple panel pattern. If you'd like to see more of what's possible with a panel skirt, go check out my Pride skirt video. In that, I cut one of the panels apart and I layered other panels over each other to create a really fun peekaboo style surprise skirt. There are so many things that you can do with a panel skirt pattern. They're really great for just letting your creativity out and making some really spectacular things. I hope you found this tutorial helpful and were able to successfully draft your own pattern. If you have any questions, please go ahead and drop a comment. I will do my best to get back to you and help make your skirt sewing experience the best that it can possibly be. I'm not sure what my next pattern is going to be yet, but I will be seeing you back here in 2 weeks with another sewing project. I'll see you soon.